Welcome into 85 at 40. I'm your host, Bill Zimmerman. Today, we're still early in this process. We've talked to Gary Fensick, we've talked to Jimbo Covert, we've talked to Dan Pompei, and I'm excited to talk to this next gentleman. He covered the NFL for 40 years. Everybody knows him well. Sports Illustrated, NBC. He is Peter King, and he joins me now. Peter King, Bill Zimmerman, how are you?
Bill, great to be on with you. How's it going?
It's going really well. I hope retirement's treating you well. I know we still hear you on Let's Go and everything, but I wanted to get your perspective on the 1985 Bears, with this being the 40th anniversary. And I want to just let's rewind the clock to 1985, where you were at Newsday, you were covering the New York Giants. And obviously, the Bears were in the NFC Championship game in 84. The Giants were a good team. Obviously, 86, they were going to win a Super Bowl. What were your thoughts on the Chicago Bears entering the 85 season?
Well, I thought entering the 85 season, they were clearly the favorites to win that year. I think one of the things that when we look back, a lot of times you look back and the look is kind of gauzy and sentimental, and I'm sure the Super Bowl shuffle and all that stuff with the fridge, and Ditka, it retains legendary status. But I would just say that there are few teams that I've ever seen in my 40 years that when you look back on them that you can't overrate, right? And that is, and one of them clearly is the 85 Bears. And the reason is, they had the best defense that I ever saw. I mean, the Ravens come close at the turn of the century, but the Eagles were very good right about that time. There have been a lot of good defenses. I've never seen one like this one. And it was very early in my career. So did I really know? Not really, but I have two distinct memories of that year. One is kind of early in the year when they were just totally dominating. I was writing for Newsday in New York at the time, and they wanted me to cover the league. So every week, I wrote a notes column about events going on around the league. So Buddy Ryan, who used to work for the Jets, obviously, used to work in New York, had a lot of fond memories of those years. I called the Bears. I think it was Brian Harlan, the PR guy, put me on the phone with Buddy Ryan, who obviously I had never met, didn't know. And he told me about this newfangled defense that they had, the 46 defense. And so we just had a long conversation that day about what made his defense great, why he felt like this team was so special. It was really kind of that was my one memory of that. And then the other thing is, look, Bill, you cannot, for people who either this is only a history lesson to, this team on defense, they were just a bunch of trained killers. They just were. Right. I hate to be, use a word like that, but they were a bunch of pit bulls. And with that sort of attitude of that we're going to physically dominate you. And that's the way they went out. And I mean, I think one of the things, and before we talked, I just wanted to make sure that I had my math right. Just think of what happened in the playoffs that year. Because to me, and I was at the Giants-Bears, Sean Landeta whiffed punt playoff game. But just think of how the Bears dominated the playoffs that year. 2 playoff games, divisional game, championship game. They won by a combined score of 45-0. Super Bowl, they won 46-10, I think.
Yep.
I mean, just that sort of domination is unprecedented before or after in NFL Super Bowl history. In the Super Bowl era, the 60 years, there has never been as dominant a postseason performance as the 85 Bears had. So when I think of the 85 Bears, that's what I think of.
Yeah, and this is my favorite stat that I don't know if anyone ever knew this. I kind of just figured it out. I mean, it's not like it's deep research, but you talk about that dominant playoff run, and you talk about the Sean Lindena whiff, which Sean Gale picked up and ran in for a touchdown for like a 5-yard, punt return for a touchdown, and then you had Wilber Marshall score a touchdown on a fumble return from about midfield against the Rams. Then you had Reggie Phillips, who was filling in for an injured Leslie Frazier, got a pick 6 in the Super Bowl, as well as they recorded a safety. So they recorded 23 points on defense and special teams and only gave up 10, where they literally, the defense outscored the offenses that they went up against.
Oh my God. Well, that's who they were. I always thought that in those days that defense, well, Bill, how in today's football that, the only thing anybody cares about in Chicago, hey, Caleb Williams going to make it? Is he going to be our franchise guy? Are we going to turn around this offense? I'm just telling you, there's a reason why they carried Buddy Ryan off the field in the Super Bowl. The defense was more than a co-star. And if you think about the difference in football then and now, I think of this difference. If you think about two of the great teams in history, are the 70s Steelers and the mid-80s Bears. Now, the Bears only proved it once, and that probably will go down for a lot of Bear fans as a big disappointment that they only won one Super Bowl, and I don't blame them for being disappointed. But in my opinion, those were two teams in my lifetime that had the most emphasis on a great defense, and they won as much as they won because of that defense, at least as much or more so than because of the offense.
Well, I was going to save this for the end, but since you brought it up, let me ask about that now, about the fact that they only won the one championship.
Yeah.
And 1986, they still go 14-2. Obviously, the Giants win that. The Bears got bounced by Washington in the playoffs with the disastrous Doug Flutie game. Gary Fensick actually told us that he thought the strike in 87 and the fact that Ditka supported the scab players really took a lot of juice out of their sails. And he never felt they were quite the same team on the other side of the strike. Obviously, they were still good. 88, they went to the NFC Championship game, but he said they lost their swagger a little bit after the strike. But what do you think it was that prevented this team from winning? Was it quarterback play? Was it they needed Jim McMahon healthy? Was it just sustaining that kind of defense? What do you think it was that held them back from winning at least one more?
You just said it, sustaining that kind of defense. After that year, they had great defenses for 3 or 4 years, but they never had the kind of defense. Bill, you described it. You said it. The scoring that they had in the postseason that year, that was an offensive defense. It just was. And you illustrated it perfectly with that statistic. And I'll tell you a couple of other things. And I'm glad that Gary Fensick said that about the 87 Bears, because one of the chapters in my book is about that strike year. Okay. Because that was incredible for people who don't really remember that year. It was easily the strangest. That's the fourth year I covered the NFL. Easily the strangest, most unique year by far of any of the 40 that I covered. And I did quite a bit of work on the first strike game that the Chicago Bears played. They played at Philadelphia, and they basically they had to go to Veterans Stadium, the Bears team. They had to go there at about 4:00 in the morning because they were worried about the Teamsters encircling the stadium and not allowing people to get in. But that's a quirky part of the story. What I also remember about that, one of the Bears quarterbacks in that game was the immortal Sean Payton.
Sean Payton, yep, part of the Spare
And
Bears, as they were
in
named.
that game, you know, the Mike Ditka really wanted to show, because Mike Ditka hated this strike. He thought it was crazy that players would go on strike, but he hated it. But what he did in that game, when the players left the stadium that day and went to the airport in Philadelphia, all of the players, and this is something that rings, that is a memory to this day for a bunch of guys on that team. There were 3 cold beers on every seat for the players on the way back to Chicago. And that was Ditka's way of saying, hey, listen, thanks for putting up with all this crap, you know. And look, at the time, Bill, the players knew that those games were going to count. And so I'm sure that the veteran players on the Bears, the real Bears, were bitter about it, not just because Ditka showed so much affection or regard for the players who actually did show up and play, but it was a divisive thing for so many teams in that league. It was very divisive for the Giants. Parcells didn't want to go to work. He didn't want to coach these bums. And so, but anyway, I would only say that I think the strike was a factor, but I also think, Bill, I think the human body is probably not equipped. Why did the Detroit Lions fail last year at the end of the year and look like a shell of themselves against Washington in the playoffs? I'll tell you why. Because they had so many defensive players who were beat up because they played such a physical style of defense, physical style of football in general. And I think it's really hard. If you ask a lot of guys on those Bears teams, they understand that your bodies, if you're going to be asked to play that way, flinging yourself around the field year after year, it's your body's going to give you an expiration date after a little while.
Yeah, and obviously that was a relentless defense that, yeah, they hit people hard. And that's, I think, the one thing, and I know we talk about it all the time, how the game has evolved and changed. And look, I'm all for safety. I am not, like, I've gone back for this series and I watched the NFL film story on the 85 Bears. I've rewatched the Super Bowl. And, you know, it sounds like kind of like the old men going, oh, you kids don't know what it was like. But when you sit down and watch these games, Peter, it is like, you know, you watch these plays, what the Bears would do with these hits on these quarterbacks that were not penalized because they weren't penalized plays. They were perfectly legal plays. I mean, not only would they be penalties nowadays, they'd be thrown out of the league. They'd be arrested with these kind of hits. I mean, Wilber Marshall just crushed. I think it was Joe Ferguson of the Lions, where you didn't even know if he was alive. I mean, it was ferocious what they did to these offenses.
And I think when we look back, you know, look, I'm 68 years old, Bill. I look back and I'm not a fan of anybody. So I can look back dispassionately. And I have come to realize, I guess if I was a Bears fan, I would be unhappy they only won one. But I take I have the opinion more of, let's appreciate what we saw.
Mm-hmm.
Let's appreciate, maybe you were only meant, when you play like that with the reckless abandon that the Bears played with on that defense, maybe you should say, instead of, oh, we should have won 3 or 4 Super Bowls, instead of saying that, you should say, you know, I'm glad, because we could legitimately say we are in the argument for the best single season team of the Super Bowl era. If you have a discussion about the greatest teams of the last 60 years, I don't know that the Bears would win of 85. You've got to talk about them. There is no question about that.
Yeah, you absolutely do. They're right there in the conversation, and with the 16-0 Patriots losing to the Giants, it opened the door for all these previous teams to be considered the greatest single season ever. So let me ask you about some of the individuals on this team, and let me start with the individual on the team, that being Walter Payton, because you've done so much in terms of the history of the league and with all the all-century teams, and obviously being a Hall of Fame voter. So I'm just curious, kind of your thoughts on Walter Payton, the player. Do you think he's the greatest running back of all time? I suspect you might be a Jim Brown guy. Like, where does he rank in the pantheon? And of course, how important was he to that team?
I definitely would think that Jim Brown is the greatest back of all time. Probably because, but Jim Brown benefits from the fact that at the time he played, there were many linebackers, for instance, who tried to tackle him, who he was as big or bigger than, and so that's the difference. I mean, even Derrick Henry today, Derrick Henry is coming up against some big dudes, and he weighs whatever he weighs, 248. But no, I'm a Jim Brown guy. But I will say this. I would say Walter Payton and Barry Sanders, probably O.J. Simpson. And I have always been more of a Gale Sayers backer to be on a list like that, even though, and it's terrible, if there was any sort of medical science, orthopedic science at that time, can you imagine the career that Gale Sayers could have had? Because we never saw, look, all you have to do is go back on YouTube and watch the game he had in the 60s against the San Francisco 49ers. Six touchdowns.
Yep.
In the mud of Wrigley Field. It was ridiculous. But here's what I say about Walter Payton. I would say, like, in the last 50 years, if you look at players in terms of power and speed and his jukes, his moves, in some ways, he really benefited from playing on the concrete AstroTurf of Soldier Field, because he could get such sure footing on a nice day. Now, on a slippery day, all bets are off. But I think he was so good at, you ask Ditka about the play calling, in his prime. And, they had no fear on 3rd and 2 of running him against the brick walls, defensive lines. They knew he would make those, the 3rd and 2s. And the one other thing I would say about Payton is, and I'm not saying he had Michael Jordan mystique, but he played at a time, a lot of his play was at a time when the Bears weren't very good, before they really got good, and I think that there is such admiration for Walter Payton for playing so hard for so long. And he played in many games that were, that either they didn't win or really weren't very important. And I think that is why he's such an admired player, both in the United States and certainly in Chicagoland.
Yeah, he's certainly beloved. There are still plenty of 34 jerseys on Sunday at Soldier Field every day. Let me ask you about a couple guys that haven't gotten into the Hall of Fame. Maybe one day they will, maybe they won't. Obviously, you longtime voter with the Hall of Fame. One on offense, one on defense. Jay Hilgenberg, who was many considered, like with Dwight Stevenson, one of the best centers of the 80s. And Wilber Marshall on the defensive side of the ball, who may not have the career gaudy stats. He didn't pile them up, but some absolute dominant play. He could drop into coverage. He could rush the passer. Sure tackler in the run game. Wilber Marshall seemed to be kind of that Swiss Army knife who could do it all on defense, and did it for Washington as well once he left Chicago. So what are your thoughts on them in terms of their resumes and how they potentially stack up as Hall of Famers, do you think maybe they should get in, or are there reasons why they haven't made it?
I think Hilgenberg's big benefit is that, I'll have the years wrong here, but there was like a 10-year period there on their great teams in the 80s, and I think stretching into the very early 90s, where he was an absolute total Iron Man. It is where, I mean, imagine you're a center and you're playing a lot of your games on the rock hard field of Soldier Field, and you're there every Sunday. I mean, it might have been 9, 10 years, whatever it was, but he was an
I can tell you, Peter, he's in 1984 is the first year he started all 16 games. He played except for 2 games in 1990. He played every game through 1992, even where he was in Cleveland. So he almost never missed.
Yeah. So that is the benefit that he would have over a guy like Dwight Stevenson, because Stevenson's career was shorter. But when you, at that position, when you start every game for a decade, and you are an extremely well-regarded player, I'm going to guess he was first team All-Pro 4 times, maybe. I don't even know. But he's definitely in consideration for it. And look, I'm not a voter anymore, Bill. I got off last year when I retired. But I think he will have his day, his consideration. The thing about now is when you are, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, that these two guys would both be now in the seniors committee in that pool. There are just so many people to consider and so many different players to consider. I think Wilber Marshall, this would be my guess, based on just my personal regard. I think Wilber Marshall might have a better shot than Hilgenberg. And it's close. It really is close. But to me, Wilber Marshall was absolutely key to that defense, not just in that little Super Bowl window, but for years. And then obviously later in his career, Wilber Marshall was good for a long time, as was Hilgenberg, but he was good for a long time. And the thing I really remember a lot about Marshall, how versatile he was, how tough he was against the run, and how many plays he made in the open field. Like, to me, in my time covering it, Ray Lewis was the all-time open field tackling linebacker of everyone. But Wilber Marshall was great for a long time in the open field. When I think of the two guys, I think of Wilber Marshall as a little more deserving, but I think both of those guys should get their fair hearing, for the Hall, because they both, I think both of them are good candidates for the Hall of Fame.
All right. Interesting. All right. Let me just ask you 2 more quick ones before I let you go. First one, Jim McMahon, the team's quarterback. Obviously, health was always an issue for him. He could never stay on the field, probably partially for how he played. He just threw his body around with, reckless abandon. But I think when you look at Jim McMahon's career stats, they're very pedestrian. There's not much there, but I do think he was a critical component of that team. They pretty much never lost when he started over those 3-4 years. They only lost when it was Steve Fuller or Mike Tomczak or whoever else. What were your thoughts as McMahon as a quarterback when he was healthy? Because I think he was probably, for his era, a borderline top 10 quarterback, even though the career numbers don't back that up.
With Jim McMahon, he's not a numbers guy. He just, if you want to look at a guy and, judge his career, of all the players I've covered over the years, it's silly to do with McMahon. McMahon's ethos, going back to, he was really the last guy ever in history to negotiate a contract with Papa Bear Hallis. And he basically said to him, because for those who don't recall, Jim McMahon came in the league when the USFL was still alive. And McMahon was emboldened by the fact that he thought he was going to get a rich contract offer in the USFL. So he basically, when Hallis gave him a take it or leave it offer when he was a rookie, he told him to stick it. And then he had to end up going back to Hallis and say, oh, by the way, unstick it, because I need to take, basically this contract. But that's who he was. He didn't care. Mike Ditka didn't intimidate him. Nobody intimidated Jim McMahon. And look, to his long-term physical detriment, because I saw him 2 years ago. He was in Vegas that week. He went to practice one day. I saw him out there for Kansas City because remember, Jim McMahon's got an incredible football life. Because remember, Jim McMahon's, I forget if he was the left or right tackle his senior year at Brigham Young, Andy Reid. And Andy loves McMahon, and Andy invited him out to practice. And McMahon and I that day were talking about, his Bears years and how he's doing now and all that. And he's struggling a little bit. He had a cane that day. He either had hip replacement or was going to have it. I forget. But anyway, McMahon is the kind of guy, he was a defensive player on offense. And he was just one of those guys, everybody on his team, from the headbands that said Roselle, knowing that he was going to get fined and all this stuff. I'm not saying he didn't care. Of course he cared. You don't want people taking money away. But what meant everything to Jim McMahon was how his teammates felt about him. And honestly, I don't think he cared what Mike Ditka thought about him. He certainly didn't care what Pete Rozelle and the establishment felt about him. But he's one of the most interesting people and players that I ever covered.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you mentioned that you were at the 21-0 Bears Giants game. So I just kind of want to finish with that as we conclude here with Peter King. Obviously that was a dominant game. The Landana play is famous for that. But in one particular player who, they don't have all the statistics back then, but watching some of these games, Richard Dent was an absolute terror for Phil Simms in that game. But even beyond that, he forced the fumble that on Dieter Brock that Wilber Marshall scooped up and ran 50 yards for a touchdown. He was the MVP of Super Bowl 20 with multiple sacks. I think he forced, and don't hold me to these, I think he forced 4 or 5 fumbles that playoff run, had 6 or 7 sacks. He was an absolute menace for those 3 games. And just, as kind of the, we talk about that defense and that relentlessness. I think he really embodied that in that playoff run and really was the driving spirit with why they were so good in those 3 games.
See, I think the one thing about Richard Dent Richard Dent was listed maybe 260, 265, but I think he was heavier than that because I always thought he was a good run player and he was a terror around the edge. Maybe he wasn't Lawrence Taylor, but I'll tell you what, he was damn close. And in the Bears prime, right there because he was his greatest in 84, 85, 86, 87. He was his greatest then. And look, the Bears were tough enough in the middle of their defense. They had great safety play. They had Mike Singletary. They had those really good tackles, interior play with McMichael and Hampton. And so usually you don't have to worry with most teams you play. You don't have to worry about the guys coming around the edge. And you don't have to worry also if you have guys coming around the edge. You usually are able to make it 2nd and 5. You can usually run on them. But I will just make this one point about Richard Dent that to me, I always thought, look, I'm not saying that he should get credit for this, whatever, but he was one of those guys who was going to play until they kicked him out of the league. And if you recall, late in his career, he went to San Francisco. He was hurt that year. Next year with the Bears, hurt a little bit. He played, and I'm going to guess it was like at age 37 and 38, for I'm going to be wrong on this. One of his teams was Indianapolis, and I forget who he played in his other year. But he was a good player as a situational rusher in those last 2 years at age like 37 and 38.
Philadelphia.
Philadelphia. Right. But what I'm saying is, if you can just imagine a guy who still has it we have to play a speed and power position. Imagine a guy who still has it for that long. I think he was easily. I think, I'm not saying maybe, I don't even remember what year he got in, but he was easy Hall of Fame decision for me.
All right. Well, there he is, Peter King, the legendary NFL writer. And of course, you can still catch him on the Let's Go podcast, of course, with Jim Gray, Max Crosby, Matthew Stafford. Peter, thanks for that conversation. I really enjoyed it. And best of luck. Keep enjoying retirement.
Thanks a lot, Bill. All the best to you. Good luck.
There he is, Peter King. That was 85 at 40. We'll talk to you next time. Adios.